Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is a special Friday crime report. Yes, it has happened again.
ABC News has learned of possible early warning signs, with the shooter displaying an affinity for mass shootings, and the FBI receiving anonymous tips as early as May of 2023 about a disturbing post Gray allegedly made on the social media platform Discord, where they say he had possibly threatened to shoot up a middle school the next day. The sheriff's office saying there was no probable cause to make an arrest at the time, but they urged Jefferson City school officials to monitor Gray, the student later transferring to this new county, where authorities say Wednesday he allegedly gunned down his victims.
Two law enforcement sources tell NBC News Gray bought his son an AR-15 style rifle as a gift. It's not known exactly when it was given to him, but sources say it was after police interviewed the teen and his father last year about online threats to carry out a school shooting.
The key to charging the father here is to show that he gave his son the gun and did not secure it after knowing that his child had severe mental health issues. And it's a stronger case for prosecutors if you can show that the father did indeed gift his son a gun after the FBI visited the house, saying that there was a report that his son wanted to shoot up a school. That would be reckless disregard of a known risk, otherwise known as involuntary manslaughter. There is precedent in Oxford, Michigan, the Crumbly parents. They're currently serving out a conviction for involuntary manslaughter. The prosecutors here in Georgia are going one step further. They're charging them under a unique statute, a second-degree murder statute, which is like second-degree murder for child cruelty. You know, you engage in child cruelty, and that leads to a death. I don't know if that's an overcharge. We still haven't seen the probable cause affidavit. Need to take a closer look at it. But you don't want to overcharge in a case like this, because you're dealing with an unprecedented charge to begin with. We rarely hold parents accountable for their children's behavior in school shootings, but we should do more of that.
The predictable question we keep getting over and over again from certain people in the society is, as always, how could this have happened? We never thought it could have happened. That kind of thing doesn't happen here, except it always happens there. This is always a rhetorical question, by the way. The people who ask it are actually trying to pretend helplessness because they know exactly how this keeps happening and that it does keep happening where they live. But they also know that the privilege they depend on requires that nothing be done about it. There's a conspiracy of silence going on, and it's been going on for hundreds of years. Now, for those of you who don't know, in Georgia, you had a high school shooting that took place. You had a 14-year-old who decided to gun down at least 2 of his classmates and 2 teachers, and to wound at least half a dozen or so others. First of all, this is yet another example of a mass killer, not a mass shooter. See, when you see the white media cherry-picking stories about gangbangers on the proverbial south side of Chicago, they use the weasel words. It's a mass shooting, as if it's the same thing as a mass killing, and it's not. You always get the story that there's 1 person dead but 10 injured. They focus on that and call that a mass shooting, and then they try to lump it in with all of these mass murders. Using the term mass shooter is white media propaganda. You cannot compare 1 dead, 10 injured to 4 dead, 10 injured, which is what happened in Georgia. And of course, as usual, this shooter already had been caught and confronted by the authorities, and they already caught him when he was openly planning to carry out this mass murder last year. The FBI themselves, Biden's DOJ, interviewed this criminal. That was last year when this happened. And all he had to say was, "I would never hurt anyone," and racial privilege protected him. He had been posting his threats on Discord, which is one of these online forums popular with video gamers. But under white supremacy, there's a subculture of video game players who are nothing more than garden variety white supremacists. We see these little white racist havens like Discord, 4chan, Reddit, and others, where these violent bigots congregate and openly plan their mass murders. Check out the videos that I've done about the 4chan racists who carried out a mass shooting at a Black Lives Matter rally in Minneapolis. The FBI interviewed this criminal over a year ago, and they decided against putting together a case against him themselves. Instead, they passed their information along to local law enforcement who, like the FBI, chose not to really do anything. Just like the FBI, local law enforcement decided all they needed to do was have a sit-down chat with this criminal, and all he had to do was simply say that he wasn't the one who posted those threats online. Why, somebody must have hacked his account. They must have hacked his account. Never mind the fact that he also told them that he closed the account because it had been hacked. Now, those two things contradict themselves. If somebody hacks your account, how are you able to get control of it back again? And then apparently it's happened so many times, he just has to close it down. Yeah, because apparently changing his password, that wasn't sufficient, right? But they went along with it because after all, complexion for the protection. The police only briefly revisited Colt for a follow-up after they looked at the FBI's information, which included the profile that Colt Gray was using on Discord. That profile was written in Russian, and it went under the name Lanza, which was the name of the mass murderer who committed the Sandy Hook Elementary Massacre in 2012. All of this happened last year, so this guy was fully known to not just local law enforcement, but even the FBI. It's almost comical how many red flags there were here. He was on everyone's radar, and yet everyone decided to do nothing about it. So was this really a law enforcement failing? Was this really a policy failing when you see that everybody was on the exact same page? We ain't going to do anything about this. Everybody at the local and federal level decides to do the exact same thing, hands off. Is that supposed to be a policy failing? No. And on a side note, while we're on the subject of how certain online forums are the go-to places for these psychos, 4chan is also the same website that the Buffalo race killer Peyton Gendron would frequent. These places are open anti-black propaganda mills that openly push for and encourage race massacres against black people, and yet not one legislator or candidate for office says anything should be done about them. Thomas Crooks, the guy who tried to assassinate Donald Trump in July, he was also a Discord user, just like this Colt Gray character. Crooks even posted a message on Discord saying that July 13th would be his premiere, and to watch as it unfolds. To use a wording like that, as it unfolds, that means that he was going to go on a kill spree, at least that was the original plan. And as we saw, even though the local police and even Secret Service could see this guy on a roof aiming a sniper rifle, they didn't do anything about it because racial privilege is the highest law of the land. It supersedes all else. So if they have to do anything that impedes on it, they just freeze because they truthfully don't know what to do. This is a fundamental societal contradiction, a social, cultural, and legal conflict of interest. People are expecting the same authorities who themselves are the dependents of racial privilege to stop or even punish other people who are the recipients of that same racial privilege. And then they're shocked that nothing happens. And since these websites are the places of choice for these killers, why is it that Congress isn't moving on them? Because the anti-black violence these websites push is precisely the message the white power wants out there. These websites serve a very important purpose under white supremacy. They say what the white authorities can't. These places are where the irregular forces of white supremacy, the non-uniformed race soldiers, get together, spread their propaganda, and plan their racial ambushes. Since the police are finding it harder to carry out ambushes against black people, they've become more reliant on the Dylan Roofs and Peyton Gendrons and Christopher Palmeters and the Colt Grays. These are race terrorists, and when it comes to terrorism, a key part of fighting it is to disrupt the terrorist lines of communication. These criminals are openly planning their attacks, and yet nothing's being done about their lines of communication. In fact, they're being protected by the state. Congress held hearings about TikTok, and they want to take over that website because TikTok allows users to post videos critical of Israel and showing how the Israelis are intentionally killing as many Palestinians as they can. The reason that there's campus protest is because all these young people are on TikTok. The white powers that be in the U.S. have lost control of the narrative because young people are able to bypass the CNNs and MSNBCs and the other white establishment media outlets. The propaganda arm of white supremacy has been broken on this issue, so they're trying to stop it. And yet you have websites like Discord and 4chan and Reddit that are routinely used by racist mass murderers or just suburban psychos in general, and no matter how many murders they commit, it's never a problem. Congress doesn't see these websites as a threat of any sort, not to public safety, national security, or anything else. They don't see these websites as needing to be censored or otherwise needing to be moderated or to compel the owners to take any sort of action. Sure, they occasionally encourage some killer to go off the reservation and kill some white people, but those are unintended consequences. Those victims are collateral damage. And you have to allow for that because the overarching goal of carrying out anti-black racial killings is far more important. White supremacy is based on slaughter. It's a death cult. So while you and I are horrified at even the idea of other black people dying for white supremacy, it's all part of the plan. They expect it, they count on it, they accept it. Now, will any of the authorities who refuse to stop this latest mass murderer be fired or charged for this? They should be. But if every other school mass murder case is any indication, nothing's going to be done about these police who refuse to do their jobs. Because after all, if they start going after the Colt Grays, they'll have to go after a lot of these suburban criminals. And they don't want to do that. That's the part that all of these people pretending to be confused about why this goes on and never is stopped, that's the part that they don't want to have to face. Racial privilege is the white elephant in the room. It is the reason why this is allowed to go on for so long and why it will continue to be a protected practice. Dylan Roof had been arrested for drugs, and yet that didn't stop him from getting the guns he used in the Mother Emanuel Church massacre. Ethan Crumbley had been caught by his teachers in class literally shopping for ammo on his phone in the middle of class. They called his parents up to the school, and then after a brief, meaningless conference, they sent the little psycho back to class, and then he shot the place up. We keep seeing this over and over and over again, example after example after example of the authorities knowing full well who these criminals are and even catching them before the kill, and then letting them go. These mass killers get caught well before they carry out their rampages. They're caught planning their killings. The authorities bring them in for questioning and then immediately release them. That's not a policy failing. That is the policy acting exactly like it's supposed to. That is not a failing of the system. That is the system working exactly the way that it's supposed to. The white media began ruthlessly covering up for this animal right after the news broke, and they intentionally worked to confuse the public. For several hours after this state-sanctioned mass murder, the white media began running stories in which they showed a black teenager. When they were doing stories about this, they had headlines saying that Colt Gray has been identified, but they had the image of a black teenager right under the headline. And it wasn't just one or two white media outlets who did this. A lot of them did the exact same thing. Now, why would they be going out of their way to mislead the public like that, to falsely put out the image of a black person as this white killer? Because more than anyone else, the white media understands full well why this tragedy happened and why all the others just like it keep occurring. They know that this is the result of racial privilege. Hell, the white media's job is to be the guardians of that racial privilege. They know that these suburban psychos are being allowed to do this, and it's the white media's job to cover for them. They've been neck deep in running interference for these guys for decades, protecting them, justifying their kill sprees, and refusing to hold these corrupt authorities to account when they routinely catch the killers and let them go. Immunity from accountability. That is a core pillar of white supremacy. It is a core ingredient in the glue that holds this whole racist enterprise together. You see, black students get suspended and expelled from school damn near on a daily basis for no reason at all. Things like wearing dreadlocks or some other trivial nothing. And they don't care about having parent-teacher conferences for these black children. A black child is a target, and when these white school administrators see a chance to attack a black child, they take it. Any little thing, no matter how petty, is treated like a capital offense. Now, if the Ethan Crumbleys and the Colt Grays, these psychopaths operating out in the open, if they were merely treated like these innocent black students are, then none of these incidents could ever happen. But protecting people from the rules based solely on race is the entire point. No matter how much phony concern the white media pretends to show, no matter how much phony outrage the politicians pretend to have, no matter how much phony confusion the pundit class pretends to have, it's all just an act. They're not confused, angry, or helpless at all. They know that they just need to pretend to care about this subject just long enough for the public outrage to die down and for the white media to change the headlines. This is all political theater meant to pacify the public and to put up a front as if the white powers that be care, when in reality, they don't care at all. This is a deliberate decision that the society made a long time ago, a choice to pay this kind of a price. The society fully understands that freedom of movement is one of the main tangible benefits that white supremacy confers on those that it classifies as white. And they know that when it comes to oppressing black people, making sure that we cannot move at all is one of the main measures of control. They know that to take away this freedom of movement would be to remove one of the main artificial structures the society has put in place to manufacture a skin-based privilege. They have to choose between the system of racial privilege and their own children's lives, and as we see, they made up their minds a long time ago. Those kids don't have a chance. This is part of white supremacy's war to maintain its corrupt rule, and as the white powers that be see it, in war there's always collateral damage. Those white victims weren't the targets. But in the perverted, sick calculus of white supremacy, a few lives here and there, even thousands of them, are meaningless compared to the racial privilege and guarantees that white supremacy uses as the glue to keep those it gives benefits to maintaining the system. That's why the white media always, before the bodies are even cold, begins running headlines and stories telling everyone how nice the mass murderer was, and how he was such a good guy. It doesn't matter if it's creeps like the Las Vegas mass shooter. In fact, the stories about him, they talked about him being a businessman. That was the main thing they mentioned more than anything else. With the headlines, they were starting off talking about him being a businessman. You had to actually read into the article to find out that he had killed 60 people. Seems there's no body count large enough for the white media to feel ashamed of telling the public how great these mass murderers are. And this deliberate, racially based white media narrative that only gets trotted out when the person who commits these slaughters is the right skin color, that lays the groundwork for all the other racially motivated shills to stick up for these killers. Because in the predictable drive to show sympathy for the devil, Colt Gray's aunt went on Facebook and made some veiled threats after she found out that the authorities are going to charge that little animal as an adult. See, white power is excruciatingly aware that it's a house of cards, so they have to be ultra hypersensitive to anything that even might seem like it's going to hold them to some sort of standard. They can't allow that to happen, because immunity from the rules, that's the highest form of power under white supremacy. Teens get charged as adults all the time. You would think that Colt Gray's aunt had heard of that, but apparently she hasn't. Why? Because most of the time when we hear about these teens being charged as adults, it's usually a black teenager who's been accused of something. Not of mass murder, by the way. Here you have a murderer caught literally red-handed with the blood of his victims dripping from his satanic fingers. And rather than beg the forgiveness of the victims' families and crawl back in her hole, this heifer boldly tells people, are they ready to see Paul Hummus blood in full throttle? Now, why isn't the FBI knocking down her door? Why aren't the police and the sheriff's departments bringing her in handcuffs either? Well, considering that the FBI chose to do nothing about this animal last year when they had him, and local law enforcement didn't do anything either, I guess we can suppose that any interview with her would end with nothing being done either. But she followed up her first barely veiled threat with a mind-numbing rant about how she's not scared and she's not backing down either, and how everyone else better check themselves before they speak about this little monster. She says that he's the one who never asked to deal with BS on a daily basis. So he's the victim here? Sure, under white supremacy, they're the only victims. In fact, that's what we saw with Dylan Roof. After he gunned down a church full of black grandmothers, you'll recall that the pitiful racist judge on that case said that the real victims were Dylan Roof's family. So we see it's not just the white media who practices this psychopathic impulse to defend the indefensible. It's also the individuals who know these murders. And she's not alone. As I showed you in the video clip earlier, everyone from the white media to anonymous randos on the internet are rushing to say that this is a mental illness. It has to be a mental illness. He was a tormented soul. That's the narrative that they always do. This is what we see from the dominant society whenever you have one of these suburban psychos who goes on a mass murder spree, and it's the only time we ever hear mental illness. We never hear it any other time. If you got the complexion for the protection, oh, it's a mental illness. Yeah, no matter how many times it happens over and over again. These guys inspiring, quote unquote, the next mass killing, oh, it's a mental illness. But on the other hand, if the person accused of a crime is black, there's no amount of weird behavior, no amount of dysfunction, no amount of mental health reports that ever has them say, well, this is clearly a mental health concern. Instead, it's a criminal justice matter, full stop. But of course, we've seen this happen time and time and time again. They do this as standard operating procedure. That's how you know there's a program at work here. There is the unspoken understanding by the majority of people in this society that when it comes to certain killers, you have to say mental illness. You're supposed to say that. That's what you say for these guys. But no pity party for these privileged killers would be complete without the white media doing everything they can to defend them and tell the public that they're just misunderstood victims of circumstance. Newsweek ran a story right after this killing where they're describing this murderer as having a troubled life. Gee, if you didn't know better, you'd swear that Colt Gray's aunt worked for the white media. They're talking all of her lines, all her talking points and running with them. And then again, you don't have to have someone on the inside when the people who run the white media, the people who are in the police and the prosecutor's offices and the school officials are all recipients of and dependent on the same system of racial privilege as the killer. Yes, this is a conspiracy of silence, But when it comes time to defend that racial privilege, they get loud as hell about it. Well, let's get something straight. This Colt Gray character, he's not some mental health case. He didn't do this because of mental illness. This is what these little suburban psychos always do. They know exactly what the song and dance is, and they like to play along with it. They go ahead and commit some ghastly act of mass murder. Then when they get in front of the camera for their mugshot or for their arraignment, they immediately try to put on their best crazy face. They do this as a matter of course. It's no different than whenever you got the proverbial white woman tears, or you got the police who are smiling as they shoot some black person to death, but when they get into court all of a sudden, oh, I'm just so remorseful, I can't believe this happened to me. This isn't a case of mental illness. This is not some mental health crisis causing these mass killings. This is a culture that condones it. These mass murderers are all completely sane. They're taking advantage of the privilege that the society gives them and running with it. When you see these phony claims of mental illness, that's the dominant society circling the wagons and using that tired, phony talking point to make excuses for murderers who in all likelihood they identify with and who they secretly wish they had been the ones to gun all those people down. They're like, man, if only I had had the guts to do that. So don't let them pull the he must be crazy card on you, because they only do that when the assailant is the right complexion. You had Jordan Neely, who was murdered by a violent thug, Daniel Penny, and Mr. Jordan was clearly a man with actual mental health issues. And yet the white media and the mayor of New York and the white governor of the state all ignored that. And as Kathy Hochul said, there's consequences for action. You didn't have anyone in the white media saying this is a mental health issue. They weren't saying a word of sympathy for him. And he was actually suffering a real mental health crisis, not a fake white media fantasy. The prosecutor who you saw earlier commenting from Morning Joe said that the Crumbly parents' convictions should have been a signal to the parents of Colt Gray that they better think before enabling their psycho kid to have guns. But that's just wishful thinking. You cannot reverse 500 years of racial privilege that's been etched in steel and protected by the very police and prosecutors who are supposed to be enforcing the laws and justified and dignified by the media, and then say, well, if one case comes down where the parents get held to account, then everybody's going to be put on notice. Hell, we all know that this Gray family was no doubt best buds with the police in their area. One conviction of some recalcitrant parents in Michigan isn't going to mean a damn to some reprobates in Georgia. What you have to do is to make it a regular thing. It must happen all the time and be publicized in order for it to sink into their thick skulls. Otherwise, it's just a fluke. And what impact would it have for the most well-armed, least restrained, least policed segment of the society, who every week we see another example of their children doing God knows what, and it being treated as no big deal? What impact would it have for that demographic to start finding themselves held accountable for the first time? Well, I'll tell you right now, they wouldn't celebrate it any more than Colt Gray's aunt did. In fact, just like her, if you actually did have the parents of these suburban psycho killers who were actually charged right alongside their felonious brats, you would see a whole lot of folks in the society, including the white media, leading the charge in revolt and fury and saying these laws are too harsh. You're sitting here holding the parents accountable for the sins of the child. You can't do that. That's what would actually happen. Why? Because they would see the pattern of who was actually being held to account, and they would say, you can't hold us to account. Don't be surprised if there's some half-baked effort by white right-wing legislators to reverse or prevent laws that make it where these reckless parents can be held to account. And don't be surprised if you got a bunch of folks on the white left who decide to say nothing while it happens. Because after all, if there's one thing we should have learned with the case of Ethan Couch, you know him, the affluenza teen, affluenza being his lawyer's way of saying white privilege, it's that when a group of people have been exempt from laws and social mores for an extended period of time, they begin to believe that the law should not and cannot apply to them. When you look at this creep's aunt and what she said, you see that's the case. And she's not even the parent of this monster. But you see she shows the exact same defiant refusal to accept responsibility as his parents did. This is one part cultural failing and one part societal conditioning. And notice the lawyer was saying mental health. This punk has not been evaluated by anyone. And yet you have the white media beating the drum of mental illness already. And they're beating that drum heavy. They don't know the first thing about this guy. They don't actually have any real claim of mental health or any sort of mental disturbance. So why are they already saying mental illness must be mental illness? It's because they're concerned that a dangerous precedent is being set. No matter how these people you see on the white media may try to act as if, oh, the father got charged. Well, it's about time some of these parents were held to account. No matter how they may try to pretend that they're in favor of it, you better believe they're actually opposed to it. They don't like it. They don't like that a rule is being put in place that effectively criminalizes the kind of white privilege that allows these mass murders to take place. The kind of white privilege that the Ethan Couches and the Ethan Crumbleys and the Colt Grays and the Dylan Roofs and so many others have simply taken for granted for hundreds of years in this country. It's not going to be racially pathologized is the problem that they have. At least not racially pathologized the right way. No matter how many times we see these mass killers and their photos all look alike, they look like they're auditioning to be the lead guitarist for a Seattle grunge band. As far as they're concerned, well, this is the wrong profile. A black person is accused of something and all the white media, left and right, are rushing to say, where's the black fathers at? What about black on black crime? Al Sharpton, you need to get out here and explain this. And of course the Al Sharpton start buck dancing, well, black community got all these faults. Need to be some policing now. But then again, that's why these clowns are on these shows to begin with. If the white media thinks they see a chance to point to the proverbial gangbanger on the south side of Chicago, they will always point to it as proof of some sort of collective black failing. That black people as a group, there must be something wrong with these people. When a Colt Gray comes along and commits this week's mass school shooting, well, he's just a lone wolf. That's just him. He's a fluke, a one-off. Mental illness, that's what it is. He's not part of some group pathology, and he's certainly not part of some white supremacist gang. It's just him and him alone. This is just some anomaly. Don't go looking over here. In fact, you shouldn't even be looking at the parents. That's just too many people to be roping into this. It's a freak event, it's a one-off, and nothing more. Hey, what's called for here is therapy, not incarceration. That's pretty much what that lawyer was dang near dancing up to the line of saying. Well, we don't need to be putting him in jail. He needs to be put into a funny farm somewhere. You have never seen the white media linking the race of these mass killers and the crimes they commit, and certainly none who's bold enough to link their crime to the group that they're part of. They don't do that except if it's black. So this lawyer, he sounded like a complete idiot talking about accountability when there's an entire swath of the society who have been socialized to be unaccountable. And you got people chattering about parental responsibility. How is that going to happen when the society has deliberately decided to make sure certain people are shielded from responsibility? Starting with the white media. When you have a racist society that makes it clear to everyone that they only investigate and punish black people, that you can openly declare you're going to commit a mass murder, and so long as you have the right skin color, or at least you don't have a black color, you're not going to be stopped. When you have a perverted racist media that defends these killers and intentionally puts the image of their black victim on the screen as if they were the killers, when you have the politicians, the white media, and law enforcement all bending over backwards to create a socially permissive environment for these monsters, then you can't be surprised that these things keep happening. Of course they will. Every major arena of the society is on the side of these murderers. They have the ability to easily stop them, but they refuse to do it. In fact, this goes way beyond mere refusal to stop them. This is the society actively doing everything it can to help them commit their crimes. The society arms these killers, refuses to check them, refuses to criticize them, even when it catches them, even if you get caught by the FBI, the society refuses to incarcerate them or punish them. And then, after they commit their ghastly crimes, the society decides that it's going to play the sad violin for them. Go ahead and praise them outright if you can, but if you can't, then at the very least, go ahead and tell everybody that this is mental illness because they're not black, so surely there must be something wrong with them. Under white supremacy, this is how you condition the society to accept this kind of status quo. Yes, people get sick and tired of seeing it over and over again, but by showing it to them repeatedly, the same narrative, they become conditioned to expect that this is what's supposed to happen. Nothing's supposed to be done. Yeah, there's going to be some few tears shed. There's going to be some angry gnashing of teeth. And then, well, you just got to accept it. Nothing's going to change. And none of these gun control activists, none of these grieving families will ever connect the dots between the systematic expulsion of black students and the total refusal to do anything about these suburban psychos. Nobody will point out how, hey, the way you treat these black students, that shows you can stop it easily. And as a result, the massacres will continue. White supremacy is the dirtiest business in the history of the world, and as the administrators of white power see it, allowing these slaughters to happen is merely the price of doing business. In their sick minds, letting children, including white children, be murdered with impunity, that's how the leaders of white power show their total devotion and commitment to white supremacy. The father of this murderer has been arrested, and this is a good sign of sorts. But I told you the other day about Kiernan Teague, the white Michigan teenager who comes from an affluent family, and as a result he had a fast car that he loved to drive at over 100 miles per hour. His so-called best friend was in the passenger seat during one of his high-speed escapades, and when he crashed his car, his friend was killed. Kiernan's mother knew all about this speed demon. She had an app, Life 360. It alerted her that he was driving the family Audi at 123 miles per hour. She sent him a text message when she got this notification telling him to slow down and that he was scaring her. But apparently he wasn't scaring her enough, because instead of taking the keys from her, she instead decided to buy him a BMW, which was an even faster car than the Audi he had been driving. So she knowingly enabled his lethal behavior. And on a side note, this criminal didn't live in Detroit, but he would go into Detroit to do his drag racing and speeding. So he decided to go from the white suburbs into a majority black city to pull this mess. Remember, family, freedom of movement is one of, if not the most important tangible benefit of white privilege, and they know just how important it is to their identity. It's one of the main things that makes them, them. It's where there's a white skin benefit. So of course, she's scared, but at the same time, there was no way she was going to put the brakes on this guy or do anything that would even slightly infringe on his freedom of movement. The recipients of racial privilege know exactly how important it is. And the authorities know how important it is to protect that particular principle. Not only has this killer Teague's mother not been charged with anything, but he hasn't been charged as an adult for this crime. You heard that right. He's not being charged as an adult, even though he's 17. The white media is predictably trying to sprinkle sugar on crap by saying that this Teague character can be sentenced as an adult, but that means nothing. By not charging him as an adult, the prosecutor is sending the clear message to the judge that this should be handled as a juvenile matter. Now, the family of the teenager that Tag killed wants his mother to be charged, but so far the authorities have done nothing. And the mother of the victim, she decided to take this woman to civil court. I guess we'll have to see what happens there, but the point that I want to make is this is happening in the same Michigan that charged Ethan Crumbley's parents and got convictions against both of them, and yet we're seeing this white lash that has emerged. You have other prosecutors in Michigan who are refusing to enforce that same law under the exact same circumstances. That's why I posted that message on X saying that precedents matter. Because we saw this with Me Too as well. At first, we had a tsunami of accusations against these white media executives and white corporate executives, and these guys were being exposed, punished, held to account. And then they began using the white media that they control to start pushing black men's faces out there, including Michael Jackson, who had been dead for nearly a decade. And then we began seeing this shift where they only covered black men who had been accused of something, and they simply ignored white figures who had been accused of something altogether. Now, they're going to have a hell of a lot harder time trying that trick with this particular circumstance, because when you have some black teenager who's acting up, that black teenager gets punished by the white authorities. There is no have a sit down with them and let him go. It's like, we're sitting down with you to tell you what charges are going to be put on you. And their black parents don't defend them either, or enable their behavior. And the white media certainly doesn't take up for them and say, well, it must be mental illness, or he had a troubled life, or he's misunderstood. So they know that these laws basically punish white privilege, or at the least makes it where the wink and a nod culture that goes along with it can carry real punishment. Look, you don't need me to tell you that these prosecutors are as biased and prejudiced and crooked as all get out. I cover for you weekly how prosecutors have these criminals dead to rights, but refuse to bring the correct charges against them, falsely claiming that they think that a certain killer's murderer. Charging with that is just too harsh. Susan Lawrence is a racist who murdered her black neighbor simply because, and the prosecutor caught flack for his refusal to bring the correct charge of murder against her. And he boldly said that he didn't do that. It was not going to be some mob that he would bend to. Far as he was concerned, charging her with littering was enough. Now, of course, he didn't do necessarily that liberally, but that's what his blasé attitude conveyed. As far as he was concerned, well, I'm sure she didn't mean to, and we don't want to punish her too harshly. Did she really do anything wrong? I'm sure it was just an accident. He knew that if he charged her with murder, she would have been convicted for murder, so he put his thumb on the scales to protect someone who he knew was guilty of murder. And when you look at cases like this high-speed psycho in Michigan, you see that this is not some anomaly. This is how these prosecutors operate. This is the culture of prosecutors in the U.S. And none of these soft-on-crime white conservatives says boo about it. But then again, your leftist activists, they're not bothered either. The white right pushes for harsher legal penalties, and so does the white left, but their demands for harsher laws stops when it comes to punishing race soldiers who harm black people. They go all quiet under those circumstances. Or if you're somebody who they look at as being an avatar for the white suburban lifestyle, well, we can't go after you either. We can't punish that kind of thing. And we certainly don't want anyone thinking that the suburbs ought to be looked at more closely. Suddenly, prosecutors aren't soft on crime when it comes to the Ethan Couches. Undercharging racists is never a sign of woke law enforcement either. So whether it's Ethan Couch who kills 4 people because he's drunk driving, or whether it's Ethan Crumbly who the authorities are told you gotta stop this little psycho but they do nothing about it, or Colt Gray with the exact same circumstances, or this Kiernan Tagg who decides that he's gonna drive his car over 100 miles per hour for no reason, they could stop all of these suburban psychos in an instant. But they choose to let these atrocities happen. They want it to happen because if they didn't, they could easily stop it. And we know they can stop it because they've proven they can prevent black children from even attempting to do these kind of crimes. But the racial privileges the white power has conferred on them is so important that even when they have to bury their own children and loved ones, they just can't bring themselves to do what they know works. So it's not just the politicians and the pundits and the white media who are to blame. Just like with Colt's aunt, there's a majority of the society who know exactly what's going on here, and yet they demand that nothing be done. When you have someone who's defending a monster who killed at least 2 children and shot numerous others, that's not someone doing it because they feel an overwhelming sense of sympathy for the killer or because they're moved by family solidarity. That's someone who feels that there's something personal at stake for themselves, someone who feels personally threatened at the prospect of this other individual being punished. I emphasize this because as black people, it's important to understand how deep racial privilege runs with the dominant society. It is an ever-present need, an ever-present hope for them, something that they require. Now to us, their privilege is a dangerous nuisance, but for them it's an all-encompassing necessity. It's power. But of course, power means nothing to some people unless they can abuse it. The rules of a necessity cannot be allowed to apply to them. Part of freedom, as white power has established it, is that there's a 2-tiered and 3-tiered system in place, and everyone understands that the rules only apply to some people, and to others, not at all. And it's very easy to see who the rules apply to when you look at who's forced to comply with them, and the reaction of the white powers that be when someone breaks those rules. So once again, for the people who are new to this subject or just so confused because you watch nothing but white media content, why does this keep happening? Well, it's not because America has a school shooting problem. America doesn't have a school shooting problem. It doesn't have a gun control problem any more than Michigan has a teen speeding problem. What this country has is a white privilege problem. There's a reason you never see black children who the white media tries to portray as the gun-wielding kids committing these kind of crimes. It's because they're not allowed to. The authorities over-police black children, charging them for crimes when they haven't committed a crime at all. A child simply trespasses, that's a felony offense. Or if a child is merely accused of something, we're taking you in and you're going to court, you better hope you got a lawyer. If they merely treated these criminals from the suburbs the way that they do these innocent black children whose only crime is having gone to school with racist administrators in charge, then these mass killings would never happen. And we know they wouldn't because you don't see black children doing this stuff. That's because they actually police them. But they're not going to do that. They can't. When they look at a Colt Gray or a Kiernan Tagg or a Dylan Roof, when they look at any of these suburban psychos, they see themselves. They see their own children or their relatives. They also see the racial privilege that is the foundation of their culture. They look at these killers and they think nostalgically about their own youth and their own behavior, how they also engaged in similar types of behavior when they were young or how they engage in it today, and how they rely on racial privilege to keep them from having to face the consequences of their own illegal behavior. So they look at these killers and they see themselves. That's what goes through the minds of those FBI agents and the police and the teachers and the relatives of Colt Gray and the white media. A culture of privilege that has to be protected at all costs. And that being the case, the slaughter will continue. This is a self-perpetuating cycle of misery. They want to have their absolute privilege, their culture of immunity from law, but they don't want anyone to use that immunity to harm them. Well, that's not realistic. But part of white privilege is being able to have the entire society turned into one enormous bubble. And where you never have to hear what you don't want to hear, never have to see what you don't want to see, especially about oneself. And there's a white media who furnishes this bubble with all kinds of self-aggrandizing lies, myths, and propaganda. The problem is the bubble isn't real, and like all bubbles, it doesn't take much to pop it. But the same forces of white control who made the bubble will simply inflate another one and take its place. God knows they got plenty of hot air for that job. But for the people who have to bury their children, and for the other people who live in mortal fear that theirs could be next, the problem here is not going to be solved by guns. The guns are simply used the same way that the Ethan Couches used their cars as a weapon, or the Kiernan Tags used theirs as a weapon. What's going on here is a culture of approbation for these kind of crimes. When the society decides it's going to focus on people instead of ignoring their criminality, then and only then can the body count be brought down. But that's going to require a level of moral courage and intellectual honesty that this country has never had. And it will also require this country to start doing something that it should have done for 500 years. And that's listen to black people. But that's exactly what they don't want to do as far as they're concerned. We don't want to hear what black people have to say. Yeah, because they already know what we're going to say. Well, that's fine. Black people telling you the unpleasant truths you don't want to hear is too much. That's fine. You don't have to hear it. You don't want to listen to conscientious people from your own community or even your own children? Very well, don't listen to them. Instead, you've decided you would much prefer to hear the sound of silence, even though it's the silence of the grave. And that's this week's Special Friday Crime Report. Keep your eyes open and stay on alert, because there's a lot worse criminals out there than the ones the white corporate media tells you are mentally ill. Good day, and be one.